In Next.js, we have another performance optimization technique called static rendering or static site generation. The idea of static rendering is that if we have pages or components that have static data, we can have Next.js render them once when we build our application for production. So next time those pages or components are needed, Next.js is not going to re-render them. It's going to get their payload or content from its cache, which is based on the file system. This is static rendering, meaning rendering at build time. In comparison, we have dynamic rendering, which happens at request time. Let's see this in action. So back to our users page, let's add a timestamp above the list of users. So here we add a paragraph and render. First, we create a new data object and then call toLocale time string. With this, we can see when this page was rendered. Now, back in the browser, let's refresh a few times. So look, the timestamp is changing. This only happens in development mode. But if you build this application for production, you will see that the timestamp is not going to change because Next.js will treat this page as a static page. And here's the reason. Earlier, I told you that by default, whenever we use the fetch function, Next.js will cache the data. So it treats our data as static or unchanging data. So when rendering this page, Next.js sees that this page has static data, so it decides to render this page statically at build time. But if we disable caching, Next.js thinks the data on this page is going to change, so it's not going to render this page statically, it's going to render it at request time. To see this in action, let's go back to the terminal window, stop this process. Now earlier we used npm run dev to start this application in our development server. Now to build this for production, we run npm run build. All right, here you can see all the routes that are generated when we build our application for production. So this is our root route or the home page. We have a route for our favorite icon. We have one for the users page, another for the users/new page, and so on. Now look at the icon before each of these routes. Here we only see circles. Now down here, you can see that a circle means static. So these pages are automatically rendered as static HTML. Now, if you start this application in production, which we can do by running npm start, and then go back to the browser, let's refresh. Look, the timestamp is not changing because this page was rendered statically at build time. Now back to this page, let's disable caching and rebuild this application for production. So as a second argument, we pass an options object, and here we set cache to no store. Okay, now back to the terminal. Let's stop this process and rebuild the application. Lovely. Now look at the icon before the user's route. Instead of a circle, we have a lambda. And down here, you can see that lambda means rendering on the server. So server-side renders at runtime. Now let's start the application in production. Back to the browser. Let's refresh. Now look, every time we refresh, the timestamp changes. Let's recap everything you have learned about rendering. In Next.js, rendering can happen on the client or on the server. If it happens on the server, it can happen at build time, which is called static rendering, or at request time, which is called dynamic rendering. So that brings us to the end of this section. In the next section, we'll talk about styling Next.js applications. So I will see you there.